Phyrexia All is One brings us Ovika Enigma Goliath. This is a 7-mana Phyrexia Nightmare. As an Izzet card, it does point us towards spell slinging. It's what Izzet does best. And every time we do cast a non-creature spell, we make a whole bunch of goblin creature tokens. So what do we want to do? Maybe make some discounted instants and sorceries, draw a ton, cast a ton, do a little bit of storming. Izzet's so random. And although I want to do a little bit of a deeper dive on an Izzet Spellslinger shell using Ovika as inspiration. Now Ovika is very tempting to brew around. Set ourselves up to cast huge X spells, make 1,000,000 goblins, and attack for victory. But there's definitely a few traps you could fall into brewing a deck like this. Let's take a look. I'm not going to give you a deck, I'm going to teach you to deck. First off, let's look at that 7 mana. That is expensive for a commander. We can't really expect to cast this on 7. If we tap out, there's no way our opponents will let Ovika last a full turn cycle. So then we could try to cast with 8 so that we've got 1 mana up, 1 blue to cast something like Mizzium Skin, give Ovika hexproof, blank a removal spell. But then we're out if another player has a removal spell. Still seems tricky. Something like Slip Out the Back is a nice one of these type of spells. It's a single blue instant and it phases out the creature. But this is where that Ward 3 comes in super handy. The 3 life, not so much. But that means if they try to cast something like a Swords to Plowshares even, it costs them 4 mana. We pay 1 for one of these instants, and they have to have another spell locked and loaded, or else we get to stick Ovika. And we pretty much have to run Lightning Greaves too. That's a 0 mana way where we can try to give Shroud to Ovika. Much like Slip Out the Back, this one lasts the full turn cycle as long as we can get out away from those 2 instant speed removal spells that we can expect are coming. And that's the trouble. Our opponents should realize how much pure value Ovika can give us. So we could try to set up a board where we can cast Ovika earlier, but I really do think our opponents will see it coming a mile away. It's very telegraphed. Let's say we cast something like Hordling Outburst or other spells that make goblin tokens, put a few of those on the battlefield. Now we try to resolve a Skirk Prospector. This allows us to use each of those goblin tokens as red mana. I suspect we'll be past a possible 8 at this point, so we're going to want to sacrifice as many goblins as we can to leave up as much mana as possible, specifically blue mana, and cast Ovika. Now, every time we cast a spell, we get back the mana value in goblin tokens, which we can turn right back into red mana. We break even on every instance in sorcery. If we can get a Goblin Electromancer on the board before we do all of this, that makes our spells 1 cheaper, so we actually profit a mana or a goblin. We don't have to use the goblin for mana. We could save them up for a big attack. It would be nice to have a way to filter mana. Something like a Crossroads Candle Guide is a way to turn 2 red mana from goblins into a single blue, or the Gemstone Array. They both do the same thing. On the surface, that puts us at a 1 mana net loss for every instance in sorcery we cast, but then if we have a Goblin Electromancer, we're back to breaking even. And now we have access to blue. So going infinite like this sounds pretty possible. Easy even. Maybe we do Storm, or maybe not. Maybe we don't need the blue and we can actually generate positive goblins. They've all got haste, and if we've got Balmor Battle Mage Captain out, all those spells are buffing the team, giving them trample. Seems like a pretty easy win. That is, if our opponents let it happen. And again, it seems really fragile, so I think we ought to take a different approach with this Spellslinger deck. And frankly, this deck seems fun. Another way to take some heat off of your commander is by running other cards that take the heat in their place. If we can put enough value down that they have to deal with that, then we get to soak up those removal spells before Ovika shows up. And if they don't, we'll just run them over with value before Ovika even needs to come out. As an Izzet legendary, Ovika is a good spell slinger. Like so many of the other archetypes, there's a ton of legendaries they've printed by now that really just do a lot of overlap. With that in mind, we can sort of create a deck that's full of mini commanders or lieutenant commanders that can just show up in the warm-up to the game, the main game being when Ovika shows up. Here's what I mean. Vadric Astral Archmage. There's been a Commander's Brew episode on this very commander in the past. We don't have to put a ton in here to take advantage of gaining the power. Just having a 1 mana discount is fine. And it will naturally happen that we will just put some extra power on Vadric, so now we're getting some serious discounts. And Mizzix of the Ismagnus. I was surprised to learn this card's only $1.50. When it first came out, it was kind of broken. And again, if we're planning on casting a bunch of spells, these discounts will add up. We should have no trouble generating experience counters, especially if our long-term goal is big X spells with Ovika to get maximum goblins. Mizzix gets us there. Now, something like Magnus the Red doesn't offer a discount on the surface, but if we can keep Magnus alive until we cast Ovika, we'll get unbelievable discounts. Or maybe knowing that Magnus the Red's in the deck, we have a sub-theme making more tokens like Young Pyromancer making 1/1 elementals, Murmuring Mystic creating 1/1 blue bird illusions. Most recently we got Third Path Iconoclast. This is a 2/1 monk for red and a blue that whenever we cast a non-creature spell we make a 1/1 colorless soldier artifact creature token. And specifically, making a bunch of 1/1s goes very nicely with Gearson Starn Kellermorph. That's a mouthful. As long as Gearson's on the battlefield, every time one of these 1/1s deals combat damage, they take an extra 2. So each one hits for 3 if remained unblocked. That's where Tetsuko Umezawa Fugitive comes in. Everything we make is unblockable at that point. And that's a tight little package on its own, but we've got other ways to ramp and other Izzet legendaries to consider. Galazeth Prismari ramps us with a treasure token, and specifically we're allowed to tap our artifacts as mana rocks without sacrificing them in the case of treasures. So it turns all of our other treasures into permanent mana rocks. If we have any other sort of things like equipment, you know a Skull Clamp's going in the deck. It has to be on instants and sorceries, but as I said, that's the main point of the deck. That Iconoclast I mentioned earlier does make artifacts, so then I'd probably want to make room for Saheeli Sublime Artificer, sort of the Planeswalker version of Young Pyromancer, only this time we're making 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature tokens. And that works nicely with Saheeli the Gifted. Remember, we're building up towards massive X spells, so now if we've got a ton of servos, artifact creatures, other things like treasures, we're gonna get a discount of, I don't know, 10, 15, that's a big X spell. And even if we're not only going towards X spells, someone like Zephi Thunder Conductor could be pretty fun. I would love to cast a massive X spell and do a random 10 to an opponent, but maybe that's too fancy. Maybe Gutter Snipe's enough. Just a simple 2 to each opponent every time we cast a spell. Closes up games quick. I'd also be tempted to run Rutha Mercurial Artist. If I am able to get massive discounts on some big X spells, I'll hold them an extra 2 to copy it. So that right there can be a fun, loose plan. I love a brew like this because it's not super linear. The deck doesn't just try to do one thing and one thing only. If our opponents are waiting for us to cast Ovika, but we're just not casting it, it might be too late before they realize what we got going on. And I think the best part of a deck like this is it never really plays out twice the same. Depending on which legendaries show up, we've got a different game in front of us. It doesn't get stale. So since this is a Spellslinger deck, we gotta talk instants and sorceries. Let's look at some very loose, very broad numbers. If you imagine you can round all the lands and the mana rocks in a deck so that the leftover slots add up to 50, it's a nice even round number. It probably is on the high side. I don't mind that, because inevitably we're going to get to the point where we just can't make that one cut from this pile. And so that means we've got room. One group of cards that most Spellslinger decks want, especially one that's dealing with discounts, is X spells, a personal favorite. Blue Sun Zenith, Pull from Tomorrow, these are classic draws. Even if you can't cast them for huge values for X, it often refills the hand in a nice way to allow us to get the extra pieces we need to close out a game, or at least see the close coming in the horizon. If we feel we can confidently get the X up to 10, I think Finale of Revelation is another one that should be added to these staples. If X is 10 or more, before we draw those cards, first we shuffle our graveyard into our library, then we draw the cards, then we untap 5 lands, and then we have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. Powerful stuff. And from the red side, we've got a lot of great damage spells. Comet Storm is a favorite because we can multi-kick it for each opponent still in the game. Crackle with Power does outpace Comet Storm once you get into higher mana values. XXX red red. I don't have a graph for you or anything, but when you're multiplying X by 5, it gets big quick. And I love the simplicity of Jaya's Immolating Inferno. We don't have to kick it. We just get to pick 3 targets. Red, red, X. The only restriction is we have to have a legendary creature on the board. But the whole inspiration for this deck is that there are so many good legendaries to pick from. I think we'll have no trouble turning this spell on. Expansion Explosion's another perfect one for a deck like this. We can copy something small, or it's a big damage and draw spell. I always like a nice Curse of the Swine to deal with some tricky permanents on the other side of the board. Creature permanents, that is. Another category of spells that a Spellslinger deck is always going to want are just some cheap staples. These spells are always castable for cheap and sometimes mana neutral. They've got general utility, think of them as grease for the engine. And if we have any discounting going on, some of these actually generate mana for us. Izzet Charm can deal with a specific difficult little creature or dig us 2 cards deeper. Frantic Search, also digs us 2 cards deeper, but we get to untap 3 lands, so that ends up being mana neutral. But if we have discounters, we're making mana off of Frantic Search. Prismari Command is a nice one because we can make a treasure to make it effectively cost 2 for now, while also doing something useful in the game. Or maybe just digging 2. I think Treasure Cruise is one of the staples. It's very easy to be able to cast this for a single blue. And keep in mind, if we've got something out there like a Finale of Revelation where we might be able to shuffle our graveyard back into the deck, seems good to be able to kill a couple of lands out of there. Every Spellslinger deck wants to run counterspells, and Rewind is a perfect example for a deck like this. I suspect we'll be able to cast it as counterspell, blue-blue, while untapping 4 lands. Excellent value. It might be worth running a few rituals. This is a way to sneak Ovika out a little bit early before our opponents are prepared for her. On the surface, Seething Song costs us 3 but gives us 5. That's up 2, plus any discounts, plus any possible goblins we're making along the way. Mandageyser has the potential to pay us back in so much mana, but it just depends on the deck. I have had times where my opponents are holding up a lot of mana to do stuff, and it only gave me 1 or 2 mana. I shouldn't complain. Net mana is a net mana. And if you're a millionaire, there's always Dockside Extortionist. $52 as of recording. Not a spell, notably, but that's a lot of treasure tokens. Excellent with the Saheelis or Galazeth. And so what are we talking about so far out of our 50 spells? Maybe we do 12 creatures, we pick some legendaries and or ones that have special utility, we pick 5 protection spells, ones that can target creatures so we can save Ovika or other things if need be, somewhere up to 10 counter spells. That's up to you. You can reasonably run just the most efficient counter spells they've ever printed. Or maybe you lean towards other counterspells that have extra effects tacked onto them. A little bit of draw here and there. That can be fun too. Put in a handful of X spells, maybe 8 of them, 10 of those cheap utility spells, some draw, some ramp, some ritual type of things. That looks like about 45 cards to me right there. Even without the rounding, you've still got room for 5 more cards. Pet cards, if you will. Quirky cards that almost don't work, but when they do, it's awesome. And if you're super competitive, Cyclonic Rift, I don't know. Shave a couple more lands off, put in a few more spells, whatever you're missing, maybe some ways to get spells back from the graveyard, a couple ways to shuffle the graveyard back in the deck, some Storm, 1000-Year Storm, Underworld Breach as another win con, Magma Opus because you just love the card. Spellslinger's getting to be a crowded deck archetype. It's almost like we don't need the command zone anymore. Maybe Ovika's just a bit too powerful and your opponents are going to bring too much heat on you from turn 1. If you find that's the case, just put her in the main deck and put a less threatening legendary up top. Looking at you, Melek Izzet Paragon. I'm sorry, Melek, it's too easy to roast you. You walked so Ovika could run. You keep being you. The game's a better place for it. And that goes for you too, the viewer. I'll see you next time. And if you're journaling for more X spells, here's a wild instant and sorcery deck, Temur Epic Experiment. I do love X spells.